Welcome back to the Game Collection. This summer, I've been playing through the Dragon Warrior series on the NES. It hasn't always been easy. It hasn't always been fun, but Dragon Warrior 4 has been the payoff I've been waiting for. Let's do this. So right off the bat, I've killed the suspense. Dragon Warrior 4 is good. Real good. It's actually probably the best RPG I've played on the NES. In fact, I was surprised they were able to tame this beast and fit it onto an NES cartridge, because the experience of Dragon Warrior 4 feels like anything but an NES title. I've remarked a time or two before on the incredible rate of evolution of the Dragon Warrior series, but I was still completely surprised by the prodigal Dragon Warrior 4's shift of focus to a more thoughtful narrative. Dragon Warrior 4 was released in Japan in 1990, taking 2 full years to develop as opposed to prior iterations which took only a single year. Time well spent. The game spans 5 chapters and features a large cast of playable characters. Chapters 1 through 4 are focused on introducing smaller groups of characters and their story arcs, establishing their motivations and teaching the player how each character is best used. The final chapter brings them all together and unites their independent quests into a final showdown that everyone has a stake in. The group of characters also has their own piece of the world to explore, and I can't convey the excitement I experienced when the world finally opened up in the final chapter so I could revisit earlier parts of the game from previous chapters. On the topic of the game's plot, I feel compelled to make a point here for a moment about tropes in JRPGs. I know that in the community, there's a lot of people out there who will say that they detest tropes in JRPGs. They think they're passé and will look at anything that sounds like a tired old literary device as a black mark against the game. But I can't bring myself to say that I dislike any particular trope. I think that cliches are cliches for a reason. They're crowd pleasers. And that's not inherently a bad thing. The problem arises when they're used as a substitute for substance. I think that any trope could be either good or bad. It all comes down to a matter of execution. So with that said, a bullet point list of the game's major plot points would probably look like a generic paint-by-numbers RPG where the writers just wanted to put ticks in a list of checkboxes. You've got a lot of the usual trappings like an ultimate evil being who wants to destroy the world, but there's a chosen one who was prophesied to don a magical armor and strike down the evil with his magical sword. But what that simplified breakdown leaves out is the execution. The way the story was paced, the way the plot points were revealed and slowly snowballed, letting the player in on just enough to keep them guessing. Probably the biggest indicator that they took special care with the pacing of the game is that over the course of each chapter, you get to meet and understand a whole different cast, and you end up caring about each and every one of them. And by the end of the game, you've got a cast of 8 permanent party members to choose from, and each one of them feels important. Just as an example, in one chapter, you play as Talon, a fat, middle-aged merchant who dreams of becoming the world's best weapons merchant. When the chapter picks up, you're in a dead-end job working towards some other guy's dream. You go to work only to get yelled at, you put in your time, come home with a few extra pieces of gold to your wife, and your kid's already asleep. Rinse and repeat. The game puts you in the shoes of Talon, the merchant, and you continue his cycle, slowly wasting away your life until you, the player, decides to break out of the norm and go on an adventure. And that's just how this chapter starts. By the end of the chapter, you care about Talon. His accomplishments become your accomplishments. If there were an RPG class, this chapter would be a case study on the importance and power of proper character development. Because over the course of the chapter, with the right pacing, this game was able to turn a tired, fat, old, boring merchant into a hero who would go on to star in his own 3 side games. Bravo! While playing the game, I was also really surprised to find that Dragon Warrior 4 also has a bit of a split personality to it. The first half of the game feels almost exactly like Dragon Warrior 3, which is to say, near sublime. Standard turn-based combat where you're free to micromanage every character's actions to a T. But then, suddenly comes Chapter 5. The game flips the board on you, and the style of play is completely different. When you enter Chapter 5 and each group from prior chapters is gradually assimilated into your little army, you don't get to control them anymore. This is where Dragon Warrior 4 pulls a Persona 3. You're free to control your own character, but other characters can only be influenced through the use of different tactics. Uh-oh. That was my first thought when I first started playing through Chapter 5. Up to this point, the game had been absolutely perfect, and then they changed the rules on me halfway through. And what's worse, they implement one of the 7 deadly sins of JRPGs. I braced myself for the inevitable pain that was sure to follow, and then, well, nothing. It was actually still fun, and I'm still surprised at how fun and playable it continued to be even after this point. In fact, the experience has shaken me a little bit, and I may need to reconsider whether or not I consider this to be in my list of 7 deadly sins. And, honestly, I couldn't be happier. In Dragon Warrior 4, we finally start to see new tiles and art in the game. Finally, the trees and mountains look a little bit different. The design of the towns and the castles within them give you a better sense of scale, and of course the enemy designs continue to be masterful, thanks again to the fine work by Akira Toriyama. Each of the character sprites managed to look unique and distinctive, and the enemy pixel art is some of the best on the NES. In particular, the art from the final boss is insane. I couldn't help but grin from ear to ear as the nightmare-fueled monster evolved before my eyes. It was simply beautiful. But not to be upstaged, Koichi Sugiyama poured his heart into the compositions that make up the soundtrack to Dragon Warrior 4. There was a ton of music in the game. Each chapter had its own new overworld theme too, which you could then change by switching out your characters in the final chapter. I have to imagine that composing for the NES had a bit of a learning curve to it, but by the end of the 4th title you can tell that he had mastered the NES's sound chip. The progress from the clumsily executed overworld theme from Dragon Warrior 1 to the intense battle theme found in Dragon Warrior 4 don't even sound like they could have come from the same composer. By Dragon Warrior 4, Sugiyama was a beast, and it becomes clear why he was sought after from day one. He was the right choice. Dragon Quest IV sold well in Japan, of course. Dragon Quest was a cultural phenomenon, but Dragon Warrior 4, on the other hand, was tragically the least popular in the United States. It was, in fact, the straw that broke Enix's back, the impetus for their decision to not release another Dragon Quest title in the United States for the next decade. Keeping that in mind, it's sort of understandable that to buy the game loose today, it'll cost you about the same as what it would have cost to buy the game new back when it was released, around $70. Woof. That said, your money may be better spent on the DS remake, Chapters of the Chosen, which will only run you around $20 for a complete copy, and of course features various enhancements. Then again, if you're not a collector, or you just don't have the room to spare on physical copies, the game can also be had on the iOS and Android markets for just $15. And so ended an era in JRPG history. Games that exploded in Japan faded into relative obscurity in the United States. And Enix, a company scorned, shied away from the West, confused about why their products weren't selling in Western markets, just as we were gearing up to enter into the first JRPG golden age, too. And this also concludes my Dragon Warrior NES retrospective. I'll definitely be taking a look at other Dragon Quest games eventually, but I'm a little bit burnt out right now, and I think I may have earned a little bit of a break from the series. But I can't really think of a better game to go out on than Dragon Warrior 4 was. It's been a really wonderful experience to see the rise and evolution of the genre over the course of these 4 games, and I really recommend that any fan of the JRPG genre add these to your bucket list. And it's for all of those reasons that each of these games has got a spot in the game collection.
Ever want to know why I feel the way I do?
Check out my playthrough by following the annotation in the lower right. If you'd like to support the show, consider becoming a patron for access to cut and behind-the-scenes content, status updates, and video commentaries just like these awesome people.